All right. Okay, Tirza, there you go. Anybody who's on screen, you guys can wave at her if you want. Okay, so with that said, let's first talk about, I gotta go in here. Okay, let's first talk about the Newburgh crisis, okay? So what do we know about George Washington so far? Seven-Year War, also known as the French Indian War.
Oh yeah, that's where he started his not political, his
military career, right? He proved himself to be a leader. That's when he started. Very good. Okay. What else do we know about George Washington? Just because you're American, like
first president.
He was our first president. Would you like to know why he became our first president? Called the Newburgh crisis. So after we won the Revolutionary War, right? Believe it or not, most of the new Americans at the time wanted to make George Washington a king. Isn't that crazy? They just
after what they went
right. They just went through this huge war, lots of death, right? Lots of loss, all these things, and to what? To become independent. And they're like, we need a king. Like, and George Washington said, no way. He was like, no way, Jose, right? So the Newburgh crisis is where the leaders of the day became split. In their decision over a republic, democracy, or an oligarchy. Which is having a king. And then Washington said no. So because he said no, what did we end up with?
Republic democracy.
We ended up with republic democracy, right? Who has taken forms of government? Have any of you?
I'm in it right now. We just learned what a republic democracy is.
Awesome! Great. Okay, go for it. Tell me what a republic democracy is.
So when people vote for a president.
Right. Our leadership is governed by whom? By the people, right? Once you turn 18, you then get to vote for your leaders, right? Right? So the idea of protest, remember last week we talked how protestation is part of being an American? Well, peaceful protestation, not violent is just another form of terrorism. Peaceful protestation, right, which is part of being an American. What are we saying when we peacefully protest? Yeah, we're saying you work for me, right? When we go and we peacefully protest, we're like, hey, remember, you work for me. Why? Because we are a republic democracy, right? A true democracy is that every one of us would have a vote. Can you imagine if something needed to be enacted, and the only way it can be enacted is if every single person in America casts a vote, and then I don't even know what our population, but the millions of us we had to calculate each one of those, right? Well, this way, right, we do cast a vote, but we vote our electoral college in, and we're gonna get to this really in-depth later on. And we vote electoral college, and the electoral college goes, oh, majority of the people of Montana want to vote for this person, so I'm gonna cast the vote for this, okay? In a perfect scenario, that's how it's supposed to work. Doesn't always work perfectly, but in a perfect scenario. Versus an oligarchy, right? What is an oligarchy? It's having a king. Do you vote your king in? No, it's by birthright, right? Whoever was the strongest way back when, who was able to conquer all the other people, right? They became the ruling party. And then it just passed from lineage to the firstborn, most often to the firstborn son, but if there wasn't a firstborn son, then it would kind of default to him, right? But typically it was always the firstborn son, even if there was a sister born ahead of the firstborn son. But we do know there have been queens, and that's because they were the only heir to the throne, okay? So kingship or oligarchy is truly by bloodline, okay? Which gets kind of weird because who's ever watched, who has watched the Robin Hood movie with Russell Crowe? Okay, and in that is a really good example of how the bloodline can go pretty wonky pretty quick, right? Because the oldest, King Richard, is depicted, he really wasn't that great, just so you know.
Yeah.
The oldest, King Richard, is depicted as being upright, he loves his people, he's gonna do the best thing for his people, right? And if you know history, that's not true, but that's how he's depicted. And then King John is what? He's just a butthole.
Yeah.
Right? He only cares about himself, right? And that actually was pretty true. But it just kind of shows you how wonky the bloodline thing can go really quick. So that's basically the difference there between the two. Swamp Fox Marion. I mentioned him really briefly last week. You guys remember? Has to do with the Patriot. Who's watched the Patriot already? Anyone? Okay. What type of warfare did we talk about last week and the week before?
He was the one who did, I forget what it's called, but it was like the kind of the Indians did.
Yes,
Guerrilla
warfare. So Swamp Fox Marion is considered the founder, which I'm not sure why he's considered the founder, but founder and the leader, excuse me, of guerrilla warfare.
Why is he called Swamp Fox?
Okay, it's a very good question, Carson. So Francis Marion, who knows of Charleston, South Carolina? Okay, who's ever been there and lived there? Yeah? Okay, what is the surrounding area? Why is it called the Low Country?
Oh, like swampy.
It's swampy. In fact, Charleston itself.
Yeah, it's just like one big.
It's one big swamp.
Like there's.
Trust me, my house was built on a swamp that had the water taken out.
Yeah, it's literally like concrete platforms are raised, built in from the like swamps and stuff. And then that's
So when
built
did you
up.
guys go to the battery when you went to Charleston?
Yeah.
Okay, why is the battery built? Charleston itself is below sea level. It's
Oh, really?
100 feet below sea level, so they had to build a sea wall. Otherwise, the ocean would always be in it. Isn't that crazy? That's why it's called the Low Country. Most of Charleston, where I lived, which is a little bit north, I was literally 10 feet above sea level. Wow. Right? It was, so the swamp, had been a rice plantation, had been drained to build houses on it. But here's what's really crazy. The water was still pretty dirty. Every house it was mandated. Every house had to have a reverse osmosis filter in it because the water table was so hot all the time. And every house had to have flood insurance because as soon as it rained, good chance we were going to get flooded. There were no basements. Let's just also say that. No basements at all. But, so that's where the swamp comes from. What are foxes known for? Sneaky, right? What does guerrilla warfare require?
Sneaking.
Stealthiness, right? So he was the fox of the swamp, right? He perfected guerrilla warfare because he was stealthy, he was wily, he was sneaky, right? He was just a businessman, a super wealthy businessman, super wealthy plantation owner, right? He was both a merchant and a plantation owner. And he just, in the daytime, would go about his business and da-da-da-da. And then at night, he would wreak havoc on the Brits, right? Havoc. And the Patriot is completely based off of him. Yeah. So most of what you see in the Patriot is actually historically accurate. There's a few things that are inaccurate, and you'll probably be able to pick up on them. But majority of it is historically accurate. Everything that it shows Mel Gibson's character doing to the Brits is actually 100% accurate. It's all the romance crap that is not. Okay, next thing, we're gonna watch a series of videos, okay? Because we talked about the revolution, right? And then we talked about independence. Now we're gonna talk about Articles of Confederation. You guys remember what colony had the best form of Articles of Confederation? I had you
Switzerland.
print them out. Colonies.
Oh.
Colonies. We're talking about America, 13 colonies.
Had the best form of what?
Articles of Confederation. Every state wrote an Article of Confederation. And there was one that our Constitution was modeled after. Yes. Way to go, Sarah. Awesome. Massachusetts. Okay, so we're going to learn about the Articles of Confederation and what they were, okay, and why were they even important.
In the U.S., we love our Constitution. But it wasn't always this way. Before the Constitution and government we have today, we had a sort of prototype constitution called the Articles of Confederation, which created a nation of independent states only loosely linked together by a single Congress. The Founding Fathers intentionally designed a nation with a very weak central government. There was no judicial branch, no executive branch, so there's no president, which when you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. You know, the colonists had just been through a really bad breakup with the British king, and they're not about to get back together with a government who looked just like their ex, okay? We've all made that mistake before, okay? You go and date a girl like the last girl you dated, you're gonna get hurt, okay? Don't do this to yourself. The Congress, which was just a single chamber with a delegate from every state, did have some power, like the authority to make treaties and alliances, maintain an army, and coin money. But they couldn't levy the taxes to pay for those things. In fact, under the Articles of Confederation, paying federal taxes was voluntary for the states, who of course were like, no thanks, we're good. The US had borrowed money from European investors and nations to pay for the Revolutionary War, but with no power to tax, the United States couldn't pay back any of those debts, creating a huge economic disaster by 1787. With no funds and limited power, the central government couldn't do much to protect peace at home. This became abundantly clear during Shays' Rebellion in 1786, when farmers in Massachusetts violently protested against the state's high taxes. So if the Articles of Confederation weren't working, why didn't they just make changes to it? Well, it was practically impossible. Amendments to the Articles needed unanimous consent, and the delegates from the 13 states had more opinions than a YouTube comment section. By the way, you should comment on this video right now. Say something nice about it. This weak Congress and a broke, ineffective federal government eventually proved to be too much of a burden on the United States. Because when 13 different state governments held all the power, nothing was getting accomplished. The Founding Fathers found this out the hard way. So they went back to the drawing board, drafting a new and improved Constitution, which is still the law of our land today.
Right. So what did you just learn
It's an
about
expensive business. Campaign costs add up. They're advertised.
the Articles of Confederation?
Don't date the girl you've already dated.
Okay, there is truth to that. But why did he use that analogy?
Because he didn't want us to go back to having a king.
Right.
Yeah.
So the Articles of Confederation, they were after the Newburgh crisis, right? Can you turn a light on real quick since you're
No.
so close? Please.
No.
Thank you. I
No.
appreciate it. So one, it was to prevent oligarchy. What was the other interesting thing about Articles of Confederation?
One was about something that taxes were voluntary for each state.
Right? Taxes were voluntary. What's another thing? This is pretty important. What type of government was it? What type of government do we have now? Right, but in that the republic,
Well,
democracy, we have three
Bureau-
branches.
judicial.
We have the judicial.
I just want.
What's the other? What are the other two?
I answered those.
What's happening in November? We're voting on a
Presidential.
president. That's the executive.
And then Congress. and Senate.
Congress, right? We also are voting here in Montana on a new senator.
Mhm.
Fortunately, we'll have one. Hopefully your parents filled out the census so we can get two. You really need a second one. Okay, we have three branches of power. Under the Articles of Confederation, how many branches of power do we have?
Didn't we only have one?
What was it?
It was, no.
Was it the executive, the legislative, or the congressional?
It was congressional.
We only had congressional, right? So if we're going to do a real life application here, okay, so here's your RLA. Woo, woo, woo. That's going to be my siren. Okay. If you only have a congressional branch and y'all disagree, how do you make a decision?
No, you don't.
It just gets, it's called a filibuster. That's the fancy word, right? Nothing gets decided,
It gets tossed
Right?
off to the side and then you focus on a new one.
right? It gets all bungled up. I'm going to put filibuster on here. Equals bungled up, okay? Nothing gets decided. Okay, something big happened this past week. In our
Oh, they,
judicial branch. What's the first big thing that happened?
Trump
Who
appointed.
died?
RBG died.
Ruth.
Right, Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, okay?
That's one of the scariest things.
Well, let's explain why it's scary, okay? Our judicial branch we want that sucker filled. How many people, when it's full, how many people are on it? 9. Yes, why?
So that it's not an even number, so that it can't be.
So we don't get bungled up in a decision, right? It needs to be odd so there's a deciding vote, right? Right now, what do we have? How many people?
We have
We have 8.
Well,
Where are we going
technically, we're getting
into?
sworn in. We have 8, but there's a candidate.
But
But
that's
she's not,
yeah, that's
she
not-
has no power of.
I know, I'm
voting.
saying she hasn't gotten
Right, so there's only 8 that has a vote, right? Easily get into a filibuster, easily get into a voting situation. What happens in November? The election. Is it gonna be a really easy, oh yeah,
No.
they're both people are really good. Whoever you vote for is gonna be a really good time. Or is it more like, one side is like, holy crap, and the other side is like, holy crap.
Yeah, both
It's
sides are-
all
yeah.
hell breaks loose either way.
It's, both sides are passionate, like there's only been a couple other times in my lifetime where I have seen this as bad, and that was the previous election. And then 2 before that, right, between George Bush Jr. and Al Gore, it was equally heated. So we're gonna make it, just so you know, nothing new. What's going down is nothing new, okay? If they tell you it's new, it's not new, okay? It's not new.
It's not even though.
This has happened so many times, okay? Don't worry about it. We're gonna be fine. We're gonna survive it. But we only have 8 on the Supreme Court. Things can get bundled up, right? The next new important thing that has happened is, what did President Trump do, Elias?
No idea, I don't follow up on politics all that much.
Wait, what do you
It
mean?
really affects you, so it'd be good to follow up.
What do you mean, what a President Trump did?
He appointed.
Who knows what President Trump did?
I don't
He
know what you're
appointed-
talking about. There's so many.
I know you guys know, I'm trying to see, do you guys know?
Is it because he appointed a new person
Yes, Carson.
before the election? So
You should know this, we heard it in church yesterday.
Oh, yeah.
I think
Yeah.
I can say it then.
Okay,
Well-
well, I think it's funny.
Okay, let Carson finish,
Yeah.
we'll hear.
Okay, so everyone's freaking out because President Trump is appointing a new person for the Supreme Court. And everyone's freaking out because they don't want it to be a super conservative person.
Well, she's not.
Yeah.
Oh,
No, she is.
Are you kidding?
She's a
I
constitutionalist.
was
She's,
like,
she's not a Republican, she's not a Democrat, she is a constitutionalist. You can choose that by the way she decides. You can literally go look at how she decides. She's a constitutionalist. She's a letter of the law constitutionalist.
Yeah.
But what do we know of, so
What do we know about
what's her name?
I forgot.
Okay, Amy Barrett,
Yeah,
Amy Coney Barrett, okay? Does the president have a right to do this?
Yes.
Yes, it is his right to bring a nominee. Just because a president gives a nominee, does that mean she automatically goes in?
No.
No, 2 years ago, what did we learn?
Didn't.
With a different
I'm
nominee.
not.
He has to go through a process. What process does he have to go? Congress, both, what parts, we have 2 parts of Congress. What are our 2 parts of Congress? One is the Senate.
Yeah. House of Representatives.
The other is the House of Representatives, right? They're separate. So we have this big community of Congress, right? This would be the Senate because they're smaller, right? This would be the House of Representatives because they're larger, because it's based off of population. The Senate, you always have 1 or 2 senators, okay? So with that said, just because the president nominates someone doesn't mean they automatically get in. They have to be approved by both parts of the Senate. Yes, ma'am.
What just makes me angry is that, okay, so when Obama was on his last term, he nominated somebody, and they didn't even think about it. They didn't even accept it. They didn't even think twice about
But
letting him
that's the
do it.
Congress's right.
Exactly, but
Historically
why are
speaking.
they letting Trump do it when Trump has done nothing but almost disrespect all of our values as Americans?
Because it's his right as president to nominate somebody, just like it was Obama's right to nominate. If Hillary Clinton was the president, it would be her right to nominate. It's what you do as a president.
It's just funny to me that even though it was on Barack Obama's last term as president, and this is Donald Trump's last term, hopefully on my life, hopefully it's his last term of presidency, but it's funny to me how they will take a nomination from Trump, but they won't take a
It's
nomination
because
from
it's-
Obama.
It's his right. This is Trump's second nomination. This is
Okay,
the
but
second
then they
nomination.
put a different Republican in
It's
the
But
Obama.
But that's his right. It's okay.
Exactly,
It doesn't
but
mean
it doesn't make
it doesn't.
sense.
Yes, it does. It is his right as president. Historically speaking, in the 44 years of presidency.
So you don't think there's bias?
I will not tell you my opinion. You know this about me, Sophia.
I know,
I'm not
I'm
going to
just,
tell you, there is no bias here. It is his right. It is his absolute right. This has happened 22 other times. 22 other times in the history of America. It has been the very last few months of a president's term before an election. And it is a president's right to nominate.
and I could get
Okay.
into a whole bunch of reasons
Okay.
why.
It is the president's right to nominate. However, okay, now it goes before the Senate. Historically speaking, when the Senate is of the same party as the president, the nomination goes through before election happens.
And that's what happened.
Historically speaking, when the Congress is of a different party of the president, right? Does nomination go through? No, it doesn't. It
That's
doesn't
probably
go
what
through.
happened with Obama.
No,
Because
that-
the
that-
Senate swayed Republican.
Then it's on his party why it didn't go through.
But so that's where you're wrong. That's where there's bias in the government. Where there's no, listen.
Obama, no,
This is
you,
literally
we're gonna take this
proven.
up, we're gonna take this up later, because I have to move through the
last
Oh
time.
my
But I will
god, y'all are
definitely-
so blind.
I will definitely discuss this with you and listen to you.
Elias,
Please.
you don't
Stop
even
that.
listen. Elias, you don't even listen to politics.
Okay, you need to stop. You need to stop. You need to stop. So if you look at me, you have a valid opinion and it matters. Elias, you're not allowed to laugh.
I'm
Look at
laughing
me.
at the arguing, not the opinion. I
Elias,
don't,
Elias, look at me in the eye.
Yeah.
No more laughter at a person's opinion.
got
Do you
it.
understand that? Sophia? Okay, moving on. We all have a right to our opinions, okay? Whether you agree with them or not, okay? Other people's reactions we cannot control. That's the way it is. Moving on. As we go into the congressional, or not to the congressional, as we move on to the Constitution, okay? Next, and I don't mind debate, but I will never tell you my opinion in class, ever. I do not want to influence you with my opinion,
That's what you told us the first day.
right? I know, but you have to understand why I had to put a stop to that. You guys understand? Understand? Okay. And it's okay to agree to disagree. Agreeing to disagree does not mean we don't like each other. Okay, so Elias,
Yeah.
are we cool?
Yeah, totally. I
Okay.
wasn't laughing at her opinion. I don't really care. Everybody is one.
Okay,
And I will never get upset or laugh at someone for that. I just thought the argument was funny.
I think sometimes we have,
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course US History, and today we're going to.
sometimes we have to be careful about when we laugh. Okay, so I will take care of that, okay? And if I need to ask you to join me, I will. All right, okay, cool. Are you ready? So Constitution, let's move on.
Talk about the United States Constitution. And in doing so, we're going to explore how the American style of government became the envy of the entire world, so much so that everyone else copied us. What's that, Stan? We're not going to talk about other countries stealing our form of government because no other country stole our form of government? That doesn't seem possible, Stan. No, Stan, not the Libertage. Cue the intro. So today we're going to learn why the green areas of not America didn't copy us. All right, so as Americans may dimly remember from history classes, the constitutional system we've been living under since 1788, the year of the first presidential election, was not the original American government. The first government set up by the Continental Congress was called the Articles of Confederation, and it was, in a word, bad. In 2 words, it was not good, which is why it only lasted 10 years. The problem with the Confederation is that it wasn't so much a framework for a national government as it was a firm league of friendship, which unfortunately only sounds like a team of Care Bear superheroes. The Articles set up a government that consisted of a one-house body of delegates, with each state having a single vote, who, acting collectively, could make decisions on certain issues that affected all the states. There was no president and no judiciary. You can try to tell me that John Hanson, the president of the Congress, was the first American president, but it's just not true. Any decision required 9 of the 13 congressional votes, which pretty much guaranteed that no decisions would ever be made. Supermajorities, always so efficient. But besides the 2/3 requirement, the Congress was very limited in what it could actually do. The government could declare war, conduct foreign affairs, and make treaties. Basically the stuff you need to do to go to war with England. It could coin money, but it couldn't collect taxes. That was left to the states. So if you needed money to, say, go to war with Britain, you had to ask the states politely. The Articles could be amended, but that required a unanimous vote, so 0 amendments were ever passed. The government was deliberately weak, which followed logically from Americans' fear of tyrannical governments taxing them and quartering soldiers in their houses and so on. But here's the thing, weak government is like non-alcoholic beer. It's useless. That said, the Articles government did accomplish a couple things. First, it won the war, so yay! Unless you were a slave or a Native American, in which case, probable boo. Second, the government developed rules for dealing with one of the most persistent problems facing the new nation, Ohio, which was called the Northwest, presumably because it is north and west of Virginia. Getting control of the land meant taking it from the Indians who were living there, and the Articles government was empowered to make treaties, which it did. Crash Course World History fans will remember the Athenians telling the Melians that the strong do as they can and the weak suffer what they must, and the Americans Americans definitely went to the Athenian school of treaty making. Through treaties signed at Fort Stanwix and Fort McIntosh, the Indians surrendered land north of the Ohio River. The biggest accomplishment of the Articles government was the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which set up a process to create 5 new states between the Ohio and Mississippi River. 2 things to know about this. First, it acknowledged that American Indians had a claim to the land and that they had to be treated better if settlers wanted to avoid violence. And second, Stan, can I get the foreshadowing filter? Yes, perfect. The ordinance outlawed slavery in all 5 of the new states. Still, the Articles government was a complete disaster for exactly one reason: it could not collect taxes. Both the national government and the individual states had racked up massive debt to pay for the war, and their main source of revenue became tariffs. But because Congress couldn't impose them, states had to do it individually. And this made international trade a total nightmare, in fact worsened by the British being kind of cranky about us winning the war and therefore unwilling to trade with us. In 1786 and 1787, the problem got so bad in Massachusetts that farmers rose up and closed the courts to prevent them from foreclosing upon their debt-encumbered farm. This was called Shays' Rebellion after Revolutionary War veteran and indebted farmer Daniel Shays. The uprising was quelled by the state militia, but for many, this was the sign that the Articles government, which couldn't deal with the crisis at all, had to go. But not for everyone. Thomas Jefferson, for instance, was a fan of Shays' Rebellion. A little rebellion now and then is a good thing. The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. Which is all fine and good, I mean, unless you're the bleeding patriots or tyrants. But to most elites, Shays' Rebellion showed that too much democratic liberty among the lower classes could threaten private property. Also, people who held government bonds were nervous because without tax revenue, they were unlikely to get paid back. And when rich people feel like something has to be done, something is usually done. Let's go to the thought bubble. The first attempt to do something was a meeting in Annapolis in 1786 aimed at better regulating international trade. Only 6 states sent delegates, but they agreed to meet the next year in Philadelphia to revise the Articles of Confederation. The delegates who met in Philly the next year had a funny definition of revision, though. Rather than make tweaks to the Articles, they wrote a new charter of government, the Constitution, which is, with some significant alterations, the same one that Americans live under and argue about today. Despite what some seem to believe, the 55 men who met in Philadelphia and hammered out the new form of government were not gods, but they were far from ordinary, especially for the time. Most were wealthy, some very much so. More than half had college educations, which was super rare since 0.001% of Americans attended college at the time. About 40% had served in the army during the war. But one thing they all shared was a desire for a stronger national government. The delegates agreed on many things. The government should have executive, legislative, and judicial branches and should be Republican with representatives rather than direct democracy. But the devil appeared in the details. Alexander Hamilton, probably the biggest proponent of very strong government, wanted the president and senate to serve life terms, for example. That idea went nowhere because the overarching concern of almost all the delegates was to create a government that would protect against both tyranny by the government itself and tyranny by the people. They didn't want too much government, but they also didn't want too much democracy, which is why our presidents are still technically elected not directly by regular people, but by 538 members of the Electoral College. This system is so Byzantine and strange that when American politicians speak of spreading democracy through the world, they never actually advocate for American-style elections. Thanks, Bob. Yes, I know, you have fantastic elections in Canada. Yeah, right, okay, all that too. I get it. Okay, it's U.S. history, Talk Bubble. So conflicts between competing interests arose quickly at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, the first being between states with big populations and those with small populations. Large states supported James Madison's Virginia plan, which called for a 2-house legislature with representation in both proportional to a state's population, and smaller states, fearing that the big boys would dominate, rallied behind the New Jersey plan. Jersey. This called for a single legislative house with equal representation for each state, as with the Articles of Confederation. But of course, coming from New Jersey, it had no chance of succeeding, and sure enough, it didn't. Instead, we got the Great Compromise, brokered by Connecticut's Roger Sherman, which gave us 2 houses, a House of Representatives with representation proportional to each state's population, and a Senate with 2 members from each state. House members, also called congressmen, served 2-year terms, while senators served 6-year terms, with 1/3 of them being up for election in every 2-year cycle. The House was designed to be responsive to the people, while the Senate was created to never pass anything, and it was so masterfully designed that it still works to this day. However, this solution created another problem: who should be counted in terms of representation? Slaveholding states wanted slaves to count toward their population, even though, of course, they could not vote because they were property. States with few slaves argued that slaves shouldn't be counted as people because, just to be clear, none of these dudes were not racist. This issue was solved with the notorious 3/5 compromise. For the purpose of determining the population, the total number of white people plus 3/5 the population of other persons, the word slave was never used, would be the basis for the calculation.
So, yeah,
that's still in the Constitution. The Constitution also contains a fugitive slave clause requiring any escaped slave to be returned to their master. And this meant that a slave couldn't escape slavery by moving to a state where slavery was outlawed, which meant that on some level, some states couldn't enforce their own laws. Spoiler alert, this becomes problematic. But except for the tyranny of slavery, the framers really hated tyranny. To avoid tyranny of the government, the Constitution embraced two principles: separation of powers and federalism. The government was divided into three branches: legislative, executive, and judiciary. And the Constitution incorporated checks and balances. Each branch can check the power of the others. The legislature can make laws, but the president can veto those laws. The judiciary can declare laws void too, but that's a power they had to grant themselves. You won't find it in the Constitution, I promise. You can look for it. And federalism is the idea that governmental authority rests both in the national and the state government. As an American, I am a citizen both of the United States and of the state of Indiana. And the national government, the one set up by the Constitution, is supposed to be limited in scope to certain enumerated powers. Most other powers, especially the protection of health, safety, and morals, are left to the states. But the Constitution also seeks to protect against the radicalism that too much democracy can bring. The mostly rich framers worried that the people, many of whom were poor and indebted, might vote in Congress people or, God forbid, a president in favor of redistribution of property. To hedge against this, senators were elected by the states, usually by state legislatures, and they were supposed to be leading citizen types. You know, the kind of good Americans who take bribes and have adulterous affairs in airport bathrooms and patronize prostitutes and shoot Alexander Hamilton. Anyway, the other hedge against too much democracy is the aforementioned electoral college, which many Americans hate because it has the potential to elect a president who did not win the popular vote. But that's kind of the point. The electors were supposed to be prominent, educated men of property who were better able to elect a president than the rabble. But the Constitution of the United States is a really impressive document, especially when you consider its longevity. I mean, as Crash Course world history fans will remember, the nation state is pretty new on the historical scene, and the United States established by the Constitution is actually one of the oldest ones. But the Constitution would be meaningless if it hadn't been ratified, which it was, but not without a fight that helped clarify America's political ideology. 9 out of the 13 states were required to ratify the Constitution, and special conventions called for the purpose. In order to convince the delegates to vote for it, 3 of the framers, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, wrote a series of 85 essays that together are known as the Federalist Papers. Taken together, they're a powerful and ultimately persuasive argument for why a strong national government is necessary and ultimately not a threat to people's liberty. Oh, it's time for the mystery document? The rules here are simple. If I name the author of the mystery document, shock is in surprise. If I don't, shock is in all right, Sam, let's see what we got here. If circumstances should at any time oblige the government to form an army of any magnitude, that army can never be formidable to the liberties of the people while there is a large body of citizens, little, if at all, inferior to them in discipline and the use of arms, who stand ready to defend their own rights and those of their fellow citizens. This appears to me the only substitute that can be devised for a standing army and the best possible security against it, if it should exist. Federalist Papers, Alexander Hamilton. Yes! Too easy, Stan, although I appreciate the opportunity for a rant. The whole idea of the Second Amendment was that the people could protect themselves from a standing army by being equally well armed, which these days would mean not that citizens should have the right to buy assault rifles, but that they should have the right to buy, unmanned drones, and arguably suitcase nukes. And by the way, in the Constitution, this is not listed as a privilege, it is listed as a right. And as a right, if I can't afford my own Predator drone, I guess the government should buy one for me. It's almost as if Alexander Hamilton had no way of knowing that weaponry would one day advance past the musket. Yes, you know how Alexander Hamilton died? Gunshot! Sorry, I had to. I am on a roll. So it would be easy to ignore the people who opposed the Constitution because, they lost. But some of the ideas of these so-called anti-federalists were particularly powerful, and they deserve a bit of attention. Anti-federalists, unlike the mostly wealthy federalists, were usually supported by common people, small farmers who weren't as involved in commercial activity. They saw less need for a strong national government that would foster trade and protect creditors. And the anti-federalists were very afraid of a strong government, especially one dominated by the wealthy. Writers like James Winthrop held that a large group of the United States would be like an empire, and that no extensive empire can be governed upon republican principles. As evidence, he could point to Britain, or all the way back to Rome. Smaller, more local governments are more responsive to the people and better able to protect their rights. To the anti-federalists, that meant state government. And while ultimately the Federalists won out and the Constitution was ratified, the issue of how large government should be did not go away. So the Constitution was really only a starting point. It's a vague document, and the details would be worked out in the political process, and then on the battlefield. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Lower. Our script supervisor is Meredith Danko. The show is written by my high school history teacher, Rob.
So we know where he stands on the Second Amendment. okay that he has that opinion. We can definitely agree to disagree, which I'm sure some of you do, and that's fine, right? Yeah. These are points, just for the sake of time, rather than making it interactive. These are points of the Constitution that make it different from the Articles of the Confederacy, right? We needed a system to make decisions, right? Articles of the Confederation, we only had a congressional branch, right? Things would go into filibuster. Things would not be discussed. We needed to have something that needed a way to levy taxes. Why? We were so in debt to the French. Like, it's ridiculous how many. What's that?
I was gonna say we're still in really bad debt.
Yeah, there's only been a few times in history where the United States has not been in debt. So again, nothing new, right? Everybody like, oh my gosh, we're in debt, we're in debt. Guess what? The United States has almost always been in debt. From the beginning, we were in debt. Back then, we were in debt millions of dollars, which means it would have been trillions of dollars by today's standards. Isn't that crazy? That's how we started out as a nation. Articles of Confederation, what did we learn about taxes? They were they mandatory, or were they like, yeah, if you want to, you can, if you
On the
don't?
Articles of Confederation.
Voluntary, right? Where now they need to be able to levy. That means force you to pay taxes, right? The other thing with the Constitution, needed more land, right? Talked about Ohio. They wanted more land. They needed to be able to have the authority to take land away from whom? The natives, right? What was that ideology called? Begins with an M? Manifest destiny, right? The idea that you're going to hear this so many times. It's going to be on quizzes. It's going to be on tests, right? Manifest destiny. What is manifest destiny then? Manifest destiny. What is it?
The government taking away the property of somebody because they think that they need it. And they think it's their
Good
right.
guess, Miriam. How did we for guessing? Manifest destiny, the idea that God gave Europeans this land, that it was like a birthright. Okay, which thinking that way, that's why they thought of the natives as less than human. Okay, strong national government. Who was for a strong national government? Hamilton. Who's watched Hamilton? They do say that he wants a strong national. He wanted it so strong that it was a lifetime term. Can you imagine? In the presidents of my time, I cannot imagine one president of my time since I was born in 1970 that I would want to be in office for the rest of their life. Like, there's not one. Carter might be the closest, but he's also because he was kind, right? But he wasn't very strong. He probably have collapsed under his authority. Just saying. Jefferson, he didn't mention this, but Thomas Jefferson was the absolute opposite of Hamilton. He wanted strong state rights. Okay, which is, you need to know this, tuck this away in your brain, because in a couple weeks we're going to find out something about Jefferson that you're going to be like, what the crap just happened? Like, seriously.
Stand up.
Sorry about that. Yep. And then as the answer to this system to make decisions, that's where we came up with the legislative, judiciary, and congressional. In the original Constitution, these branches, did one of them have more power than the rest? No. In the original Constitution, none of them. Something happened in the mid-1860s, though, that we're going to learn about in a few weeks, where you're going to see that this one gets more power. Okay. All right. Next thing. So by the end of the year, you're going to have all 27 amendments memorized. Okay. I'm not joking because I pray over each one of you guys by name every single week. Okay. And as I was preparing for this class, before I even knew you, I really felt the Holy Spirit tell me that you guys needed to know the amendments. Okay. So your future, you need to know your amendments. You need to know your rights. Okay, no matter where your opinion is. Am I going to expect you to have all of these memorized overnight? No, we're going to do a trickle down, 4 at a time. Okay, 4 at a time. And when I quiz you on this, I'm not going to ask you to write it out word by word, okay? But it will be matching, okay, or it'll be multiple choice. But you will, that is something by the end of this year, all 27 amendments, okay? So every 2 weeks, I'm going to ask you to memorize 4 more, okay? So part of your homework, I want you to begin to have the first 4 memorized, okay? And then the second week. Then when you come back in 2 weeks, you're gonna have your first quiz on them. How many?
4.
Just 4, right? Just 4, right? You probably already know 2 of them. What's the first one?
Is the right?
We just, Sophia and I just exercised it. What was it? Freedom of speech. Who went to church on Sunday? First Amendment, freedom to practice your beliefs, your religion. We have the freedom to be Catholic. We have the freedom to be Protestant. We have the freedom to be satanic. It's all protected, right? That's powerful. At this time, Sophia, will you please stay?
No, I'm gonna leave.
Are you leaving school?
What?
Are you leaving school?
No, I'm gonna leave this class
Okay.
and go home and then
Okay.
talk to.
Okay. Sophia, your opinion matters,
No.
and I wish, yes, it does, but I
Not
really wish you
really
would.
for him or you.
No, it does matter to me. Anyhow, so what's the Second Amendment?
The right to bear arms.
The right to bear arms, right? So, right there, you have half of the 4 that I'm asking you guys to memorize, right? Those are 2 of the most talked about amendments, right? The first and the second, first and second, okay? So we're gonna watch a little bit about the amendments, like what the heck, why do we even have amendments?
Here in the United States, we have a government. That government is regulated by the Constitution of the United States, and the Constitution doesn't always make everyone happy. So we have these things called amendments that help us periodically tweak or amend our Constitution to help keep up with the times, kind of like software updates. So what are these amendments? So the first 2 amendments are perhaps the most famous of them all, particularly the second for its controversiality. The US Constitution actually has 27 amendments. 27? How many guts do you even need? Amendments can be either made by Congress and voted by 2/3 of each house, the Senate and Representatives, and 3/4 of state legislatures, or the state legislatures can call for a constitutional convention, although the latter has never happened. Here are my attempts to explain them all one by one and hopefully dumb them down in the way that at least I can personally understand them. The 27 amendments can range in all sorts of areas, including the First Amendment, established in 1791, which establishes the rights to freedom of religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition. This means that Americans can practice any religion or lack thereof, speak their mind, newspapers can talk about whatever, groups can assemble for protests, and Americans can make petitions for the government. The Second Amendment, also in 1791, establishes the right to bear arms. This amendment has come under heavy fire, pun partially intended, in recent years, as to the advent of mass shootings and the NRA. The amendment was established with a, quote, well-regulated militia in mind, as America, of course, wasn't quite the superpower it is today, but a small, scrappy collection of states that had only recently become a country. The Third Amendment establishes that during a time of peace, soldiers cannot be quartered in someone's household unless consent is given by the homeowner. So if the US government wanted to station some US Army troops in my house, essentially living here, then unless our country is at war, I have the right to say, guys, what the hell are you doing here? Go find a Motel 6. The Fourth Amendment protects Americans against unfair and unreasonable searches and seizures of property. This means that if the police or the government wanted to search through my house and search my stuff and my messages, then they will need a warrant and or reasonable cause for suspicion in advance. So if the police just broke into my house to search my stuff and take my stuff, and they didn't have a warrant or a good reason, then no, they actually can't just break into my house like that. Don't do that. The Fifth Amendment.
Okay, we just went over, we're gonna go through this, okay? A little bit at a time. It's good, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a good explanation. Okay, so First Amendment is about
Religion, freedom of speech.
It was like news. newsletters.
Oh yeah, like the newspaper could print anything, which is also.
Yeah, right? So you may disagree with what mainstream media puts out, right? But are they protected? Totally. That's freedom of speech. If you don't like it, don't read it. If you don't like it, don't watch it, right?
Yeah.
But they are protected to say whatever the crap they want. It can be completely bogus. And I have seen bogus stuff on the extreme left, and I've seen bogus stuff on the extreme right, right? Believe it or not, the earth is round. It's not flat.
Actually, I
know.
believe it's on a turtle.
He's going with Iroquois. Right? So you see what I'm saying? Like, they are protected by that. All right? That's a beautiful thing. If you don't like it, don't read it. Period. Right? Second Amendment. What is it about?
Right to bear arms.
Right to bear arms.
Which there are some guns that are still legal, like a rocket launcher.
But let's stop and break this down. It was the right to form a militia, right?
Mhm.
That's a big deal. That's about protecting ourselves. So whether
Which
you're
the National Guard is a militia, right?
not anymore, and we'll talk about what happened in the late 80s, early 90s, where it switched to becoming a militia. Okay. But it initially, that's what the National Guard was for, and same with the Coast Guard. But with that said, right, we have the right where if, let's say, everything goes haywire tomorrow, and all of a sudden our police force and our military starts bulldozing through our town, right? We have the right to fight back, and we will be protected by that, right? Okay. All right. So whether you think it's the extreme, like only forming a militia, like the National Guard, or whether you're on the other side where, yeah, I can own military issued automatic weapons, right? Which is illegal. Nobody is allowed to own, and no civilian is allowed to own an automatic weapon. They can own a semi-automatic, which is a hunting gun, right?
Somebody own a tank. Is that legal?
Believe it or not, and that's what,
Yeah.
like in the first one that we saw, believe it or not, the Second Amendment protects us to have our own tanks. It protects us to have our own rocket launchers, RPAs. Like, it's more, we're more protected to have those big things than we are like an automatic. Mhm.
We do a playground for a guy at my his place, and he has a whole bunch of army rigs, like
Yeah.
tanks and everything.
There's
He's got shops loaded.
Yeah, so if you were to go to Immigrant, there's a whole church group called Church Universal Triumphant, and they all own also RPGs like up the wazoo and stuff, but they're protected, right?
They're prepared for the apocalypse or something.
That's the only reason I.
However, they have been raided before and confiscated, and that's due to conversations they had in threatening the government of Livingston. So just to let you know, they did misuse it. What was the third about? What was third? We'll rewind and
Religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition. This means that Americans can practice any religion or lack thereof, speak their mind, newspapers can talk about whatever, groups can assemble for protests, and Americans can make it unless consent is given by the homeowner. So if the U.S. government wanted to station some U.S. Army troops.
Okay. What is the third about?
The army can, or the military can't force you to invade your home without your permission unless there's a war.
They can't take your food. They can't say, hey, we're kicking you out of our house. We're gonna set up a military base in your home, right? Where did that come from? Why would that be part of
Didn't
it?
Because-
the loyalists?
Okay, wait. I'm gonna go in first.
Didn't during the revolution, like a lot of people had a house for the military, or the.
They would just come in and say,
Yeah.
you're out. They make them homeless. They eat their food. They demand that they would eat their food. So that's why the Third Amendment was made, right? So if you had, this happens over in Butte, the the special ops train a lot over in Butte because it's such a similar topography to Afghanistan. And so imagine if the special ops were like, hey, we're here for 10 weeks, we're booting you out. That's what the Third Amendment protects. It protects our military. What's the Fourth Amendment? It's
The warrant one?
yes, search and seizure.
So you need to have a warrant.
Against unfair and unreasonable searches and seizures of property. This means that if the police or the government wanted to search through my house and search through my stuff and my messages, then they will need a warrant and or reasonable cause for suspicion in advance.
Okay, who's watched the crime show? Okay, how many times you're like, do you have a warrant? Right? Almost all the time, right? They always talk about it. Gotta have a warrant. Gotta have a warrant.
That is the
What that is investigators. They must prove to a judge or a DA, right, that there is reasonable cause that you are under suspicion. Okay, so let's say somebody, like right now, Stockman Bank over here is getting robbed, right? And they're like, we saw a gray Toyota Highlander parked in front. Saw a woman wearing a green sweater with a white mask on. She had long blonde hair. We think it might be Suzanne Havenmore, right? So before they could search my car, before they could search my house, before anything, they'd have to show more reasonable cause than just what I look like, right? They'd have to lift the fingerprint. They'd have to have somebody actually identify me, maybe in my car, putting my mask on. They're like real reasonable cause. If they could get enough of it, then they would get a warrant, and then they could come in. So, yes, Carson.
How do people get warrants so fast to like search a car and pull over?
Well, typically, because we live in a computer age, they can, like, there's already stuff that's gone out, right? Let's say it was a bank robbery. All of this stuff has already gone out. Like as soon as that is happening, maybe as soon as the bank robbers leave, people are on their phones, the bank president, all of that, it's already going out even before the cops even get there. Cops get there, they immediately start lifting fingerprints, maybe there's some DNA, something like that, right? And that's out within seconds, believe it or not. So then when they go out and they pull over a car that people saw them leaving in, they already have a warrant. Didn't used to happen so fast. When I was your guys' age, warrants took 24 to 7 days, 24 hours to 7 days, right? Just we didn't have the fast computer connections that we have today. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Yes. So if you were ever pulled over, right, and they're like, hey, well, I want to look at your trunk, you have the right to say, do you have a warrant for that, right?
Yes.
You have the right. Anybody ever came to your house because you guys are schooled non-traditionally? Somebody ever came to your house and they're like, hey, are you in truancy? You're like, no, I go to Emerge. And they're like, well, we need to see proof of that. It's when it talks about messages, that includes your computer, that includes your phone, your mom's phone, your dad's phone, right? We'd have to say, do you have a warrant for that? Right? And because you also live in the state of Montana, your voice, our Constitution is so freaking cool in Montana. I love our Constitution, Montana State Constitution. The voice, the opinion of a 1-year-old, right, if you could talk clearly, equals to mine. Wow. We're one of the only places in the world where a child's opinion is equal to an adult's in a court of law. That's fantastic. And if anybody in the state of Montana ever tells you different, they're blowing smoke. Like, I am serious, okay? So with that said, your homework, real quick, let's look at it. Homework is going to be, you begin memorizing the 4 amendments, right? You just rehashed them. You need to read pages 6 through 38. The first, half of that is just it's Uncle Eric telling you that he's a constitutionalist. He's telling you this is where I'm coming from, but I would like you to read that, okay?
What does constitutionalist mean?
A constitutionalist means, and that's, a constitution means when the Second Amendment, when it says you have the right to bear arms, I have the right to bear arms.
Okay, so it like
Period.
follows everything.
It's the letter of the law.
Okay.
Right,
They
straight
follow
down the
the
line.
law.
There's no interpretation. It doesn't go on the right side of interpretation, doesn't go on the left side of interpretation. Straight letter of the law, exactly what it says. That's what a constitution, it goes into that in the first two chapters, really deep on what it is. If there's a fancy name for it, it's called a jury naturally. It's French. You need to do that. You need to do your vocab sheet. And then I just want you to answer the question, what is the difference between the Constitution and the Bill of Rights? Okay? I've given you a link that explains it. There's a YouTube link you can watch that explains the difference between the two. Because why did we have to have the Bill of Rights? If our Constitution was so great, then why do we have amendments? Right? So, there you go. Awesome. Have a really great day. Yes.
Don't forget about that app that you're gonna.
Yes. Thank you. If you don't get it by tomorrow, email me. Hi.
Can I run your HDMI cord?
Yeah, it goes, the HDMI cord, it goes into the study hall room. I steal it from there. Oh, so I'll just leave it if you want to take it back.
Okay, that'd be great. I forgot my.
Yes, ma'am.
So I noticed last week you marked me tardy for class. Teacher didn't let us out till.
Oh, just like,
Miriam.
yes, Ireland let me know.
Yeah.
Okay, so I will mark you guys, I'll change it.
Who's
Okay.
your teacher? I told me that helped you.
Oh,
Yeah, I think Colleen talked to him.
Yeah, she did. Okay. So thanks for letting me know.
Yeah, these two are trouble.
Me?
Yeah. I'm majorly a troublemaker. I can't even talk about.